My guest today is Deep Left Analysis. He is a writer, pseudonymous writer that I found on Substack. He has quite a few engaging pieces, but the one that we discussed today and the one that I found most interesting recently is his writing on race realism, so called human biodiversity, and its mainstreaming and its potential downsides or dangers. I think he has a really fresh angle on this, one which is surprisingly congruent with a lot of dissident right thought. So, yeah, I think this is going to be a very engaging and interesting episode. I hope he comes back because, like I said, he has a very generative pool of new ideas, and I think, to be honest, I think he's going to go places if my instincts are correct, and they sometimes are. So if you like this conversation, this time I've put the whole conversation because he only had an hour, so I don't want to chop it up and put little bits of it in on YouTube or wherever. So this is the whole conversation. But if you'd like to support the podcast, and if you'd like to hear complete conversations from now on too, please do go to alexkashuta.com. That's my Substack. And if you'd like to become a contributor, I would really appreciate it. It really helps me, keeps the lights on, as I always say. And also, there's a Patreon that's also really helpful. So wherever you think you might want to contribute, that would be much appreciated. Please enjoy my conversation with Deep Left Analysis.
So you've come across my radar recently with quite a few pieces. I think one of the most engaging, interesting, and one that's kind of confluent with a lot of my thinking lately has been, this is not just one piece, this is kind of a series of things that you've been talking about the mainstreaming of so-called human biodiversity and its impact. And I know a lot of people have a lot of zeal, myself included. I've spoken about this publicly, and I've been on the Nathan Kofnes Cremieux side of things in the sense that it does seem to me to be kind of the skeleton key for wokeness. It really is kind of the founding myth for this beast that everyone seems to be trying to kill online. And I've been of the opinion that, okay, if people are not aware of this information, obviously it's impossible to kill this dragon. You've written about this in a bit more of a critical light. This is a point of view that I'm kind of coming around to. So maybe you could just introduce your position on this. And why is the mainstreaming of LGBT maybe not the best idea?
Well, when I was an autistic teenager running around, showing my friends these HBD videos online, I was really kind of dismayed that I was getting a lot of blank stares. I was getting a lot of non-responses. I was getting a lot of just like people were not convinced by facts and logic. And coming from that disposition, which in the article, I say it's a common disposition among people who are attracted to libertarian atheism. So people who say like, well, clearly, big bureaucracies are inefficient. The market's more efficient. Clearly, religions are full of superstitions. They're dogmatic. They're not based in science. And so why don't we just do what the evidence says? Why don't we just empirically look at reality? And the truth is that is maybe like correlated with INTJs and a bunch of other personality traits that are relatively rare and kind of extreme. And I just say that as somebody who has a lot of those personality traits. And so I think people make this mistake where they look out at the world and they say, well, if only we could red pill Bill Gates, if only we could show him the IQ stats, then all of his policy positions would change. And the approach that I have come to take over like years of banging my head against the wall and not achieving success is to say that, actually different classes of people have different interests, and people are cynical and people use motivated reasoning. So even very smart people can convince themselves of positions that may not be true if those positions are extremely if almost their life or death depends on that. They will figure out a way to excuse, ignore, whatever, contort the truth to fit that narrative. People are selfish. Sebastian Jensen, who you've had on, he has an article saying that like narcissism is the human default, and people, people, and this is kind of like something that sometimes is a basis for libertarianism, is that, well, since people are self-interested, let's just sort of let them do what they want and see where that falls, because that's the most powerful, human desire is this internal selfishness. So why don't we stop trying to run against it and just let it go? Um, there's a problem with that from, we're talking about religious conversion fundamentally. I mentioned Richard Dawkins. I mentioned, the history of how we switched from being really a racist country. I mean, I know I'm just a big liberal for saying that, and conservatives don't want to hear that, but it's like, we actually were a very racist country, and then we changed. Something changed. How did that happen? It wasn't because a majority of people started reading Franz Boas and they said, oh, well, actually, it's environmental determinism and we're not racist anymore. No, it was elites decided, and the reasons they decided is extremely interesting, and I think it's extremely relevant. The elites decided we're not going to have segregation anymore, and they orchestrated the largest military occupation on American soil between the Civil War and Joe Biden's response to January 6th, the inauguration. There was like 20,000 troops, live ammo pointed at teenagers. A lot of the people protesting desegregation were actually the students, not just, Klan members or something, but like teenagers and even younger. It was very difficult. It was very expensive. It caused the greatest third-party revolt since Teddy Roosevelt. George Wallace was the most successful, from the Electoral College, the most successful third-party candidate of all time. And he was like, I crunched the numbers, and I'm like, if he was just like 5 to 18% more effective, and I think I go into the specifics of that, of how he could have done that, he could have easily forced a contested convention of the Electoral College, meaning that Congress would have had to directly vote for the president, which would have been very disruptive. It was in the middle of the Cold War, and our entire thing was, we're a democracy. And then we have this huge uprising of millions of people voting third party, and then the government has to, it's very embarrassing from an international perspective. And our NATO allies and everyone else was very like looking at this like, is the United States stable? Is it a legitimate government? Do the people trust in the government? So that was a huge propaganda blow at the time. And elites were aware of that. Felix Frankfurter wrote about, this is a dangerous thing to do. We should be careful about this. They ended up doing it anyway, and the backlash, it didn't result in a civil war, but it was very disruptive, and it ultimately cost a lot of political capital down the line, because I think when you look at the conservative movement today, a lot of its resentment can be traced back to civil rights. Now, they won't admit that, like Dinesh D'Souza is not going to say, well, I'm mad about desegregation, but there is a definite link where, Kevin Phillips, who is a Republican strategist, he popularized the term Southern strategy. He writes about how there was a transition between open opposition to civil rights to then taxes, and there's a clear transition there. And for some people, that's a conscious, like for Kevin Phillips, he was consciously making that transition. And for other people, it was subconscious. But I think we're still actually dealing with, and of course, the hereditarians will agree with me on this and say, like, civil rights has a huge cost associated with it. So why were elites willing to take that step, which was dangerous, which was associated with a huge cost? Were they stupid? Were they crazy? Were they pathologically altruistic? These are some of the theories that are put forth. I don't think any of them are valid. I also don't think the idea that, it was Jewish people who dominated the Supreme Court, that's factually not true. So I think we have to discount all those theories, and we have to look at new theories, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So you've been teasing this, what is your theory about why did elites decide on the strategy?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting thing that happened economically, that I interact with a lot of leftists who are, their priority is a renaissance of the working class. They want to bring the working class back. They want to bring factories back and industrialism and a working wage, and they want to see rising wages. They want to return to that paradigm because that paradigm was really, really successful in the late 19th and early 20th century. Something has happened in the last 50 years that has made that paradigm almost completely irrelevant. We don't think about it. We don't talk about it. Workers' rights, it's just something that's almost like some sort of placebo that's thrown out there, or these but everybody has noticed since Occupy Wall Street, there's been an acceleration of that trend of, Hillary Clinton and the Democrat Party just slapping Bernie Sanders down, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's other people on the left who claim that actually Biden did a lot for workers' rights and so on. So there's disagreement among the camp of what's going on. I tend to be more of the position of the data indicates that workers' rights really are on the way out. And so then the question is, why did they ever succeed? Like, Europe used to be a feudal serf-based economy. How did workers gain their rights? And I think the answer is that industrialism was not only an economic issue, but it became a military issue. The most important historical figure that I think people underplay is General Erich von Ludendorff, and he was the second in command to Hindenburg during World War I. He wrote an extremely long, well, for the historical time period, it wasn't that long, but it's 800 pages of memoirs in 1919, immediately after the war. And you read that, and you're thinking, well, he's this Prussian aristocrat, right? And he's a monarchist, and he has these old stodgy conservative ideas. But he openly says, like, what we should have done, because it's a book about what we should have done during World War I, because we lost. And he says, well, what we should have done is we should have taken all of the media, shut down every newspaper, and replaced it with a central propaganda organization. And this organization should have hammered the point that Germany is fomenting a socialist revolution, and we are fighting international capitalism. This is not something I expected to find in that book, but that's what he was saying. And he lays out, I take it kind of cynically. I mean, maybe he was more of an idealist, but he lays out kind of an argument to his fellow aristocrats of, like, here is why this is necessary. You can't run a war the way that we ran the war. It was entirely inefficient. It was bureaucratic. He absolutely hates the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy and the monarchy, and he thinks they're all trash. Throughout the memoirs, it sounds like he's basically advocating for an overthrow of the monarchy. At least in Austria, in Germany, he like maintains the loyalty, but later on, within a few years, in 4 years, he's marching with Hitler trying to do a coup. So you see that his position in 1919 was almost on this precipice where he's trying to maintain his loyalty to the Kaiser, but he's also looking forward to what would then be called National Socialism. And that's not just, well, maybe Hitler might have read the memoirs, or maybe there was some kind of influence. It's like, no, these guys were hand in hand marching down the street with guns together. They were planning a coup together. Of course, Hitler didn't like Ludendorff on a personal level. They had some personality disagreements, but there's a clear link there. So I take that, and I did a response to Richard Hanania on unionization and how, yeah, there are costs to unions. Unions are not a very efficient way to improve an economy or something like that. But the reason why they happen is because of what I would say is a fundamental connection between military matters and economy. You can't just say, oh, well, we're going to have this great economy, but we can't fight wars. I mean, war fighting and the necessity of maintaining a popular morale became the central question for any state administration. How are we going to construct a society where, like, the vast majority of people are willing at a moment's notice to drop everything, start working in a factory in a total war economy for 12 hours a day, leave their homes, sail across the ocean and start, killing people that they don't know? How are we going to achieve that? Because that wasn't really a normal thing in history. outside of like the religious crusades. People would go to Jerusalem. And so I think there was this secular religiousness that was constructed around workers' rights, around nationalism, around the concept of the folk or the people. All of these ideas were swimming around this central question of how do we create not just economic efficiency, but how do we create secular religions? And I call that, describing Ludendorff's view as a spiritual nationalism. And a lot of other people have said that, Marxism is basically a form of religion. It's got its own telos, its deontology, it has the heavenly kingdom when you achieve full communism and so on. So I see all of those as different attempts circling this central problem. And that's why I would say that someone like FDR, who becomes president in 1932, he brings in with him a bunch of people who I would just refer to as American communists. Now, they were not Soviet communists. They were not Maoists. They had clear distinctions. They were not in favor of burning down churches or something, or like abolishing marriage and those sort of ideas. But they did share a lot of the same ideology. And when FDR actually got to sit down with Stalin and negotiate, in the Yalta conference or something, he said, Stalin, why don't you take India? And Stalin's like, I don't know. That's part of the British Empire. What are you talking about? And FDR is like, no, really, I'll help you. Like, you can invade India and we'll destroy the British Empire together. And Stalin's just like, wait a second, my propaganda tells you that you're an evil capitalist and you hate me. But evidently that was not true. FDR and those, again, I would call them American communists. We could use a more friendly term. But they really saw, they really felt that there was almost like a Menshevik strategy that was optimal for America, where you sort of slowly boil the frog. We're going to achieve this perfect society, but we need to take into account the fact that there are segregationists, there are conservatives, there are Christians, and we're going to have to work with them. So FDR's vice president was a segregationist when he first got elected. So that's very confusing to a lot of people. And it's confusing for a good reason, because they were being sneaky. They had a public position and a private position. But yeah, I think that when you look at Germany and you look at Russia and you look at America and you look at all these different powers, and even in Britain you had Oswald Mosley, who was part of the Labour Party and then became a fascist, or Mussolini, who was a Marxist and then became a fascist. I think you're seeing all across the Western world plus Russia, you're seeing this recognition or realization that in order for a state to survive and thrive in an expansive sense, in an imperial sense, or even just to defend itself from other powers, it's going to have to create new forms of secular religion. And that's going to include some concept of the nation or the people or the working class, to mobilize masses of people to be fanatical, because no one wants to work a 12-hour shift in a factory. No one wants to ship off across the sea and kill people they don't know. But you have to create this new civic religion. And we can even go back to Napoleon. We can talk about Machiavelli. I mean, so this is a very long process that brings Europe out of that feudal order where peasants are basically disregarded and completely irrelevant to the military and the economy for the most part, because it doesn't matter how hard you farm. Farming is not a question of effort in, food comes out. It's you have actually land is the ultimate determinant of how much food you can produce at that time. They didn't have fertilizers or tractors or anything. So that economic shift, I think, is ultimately responsible for these ideological shifts. And now that we're in this quote unquote post-industrial age, all of those incentives have collapsed. There's no reason to promote workers' rights, because I can just have a bunch of robots create a bunch of trucks in a factory, or I can have a bunch of robots automate the production of drones, which can be commanded by, some nerd.
We had a little hiccup here, but it's all good. We're just about to slide into discussing how all of this refers to our current moment, which I think is really interesting, because what I've noticed, and what a lot of people in the wider so-called dissident right, and a lot of kind of this analysis post-Trump, post-first Trump Trump won, um, it's been the conclusion is slightly similar to this. The idea that there is no state without a civil religion. A lot of people are now trying to revive older forms of organization, be it the nation state, quirky things like, Christian nationalism, Christianity, integralism, all sorts of things that are supposedly more solid. The problem is buy-in, both on the ground level and on the elite level, is quite weak, and it's getting weaker for a lot of these things because of all of the things that you described. Essentially, the incentive structure is very dissimilar to what it was in the 1800s, 1900s, and it's changing in the direction of disintegrating all of these forms of states of aggregation. So I wonder what your position is in terms of essentially kind of what you see now with what's going on. So you see, HBD is becoming, Elon Musk is essentially talking about it publicly. He's the richest man in the world. There is quite a lot of awareness being spread. Do you think this is kind of an inevitability at this point? It kind of does seem like more people know about this than they're definitely, used to even 2 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I would compare it to a lot of other paradigm breaks that we've had. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein, that story is not something that is normal. You don't just say, well, yeah, business as usual. Dude has a temple on a private island where all the rich people go and whatever. And I'm not saying that as someone who myself is shocked that some rich guys are up to no good or whatever. I mean, I think that 10,000 years back, they would have been doing the same thing. So I'm not super surprised by it myself, but for the average person, having those sort of news stories on blast all the time, I think is Richard Hanania has this phrase he's come up with. I think it's the Dale Gribble voter. So the Gribble, they're like supporting RFK, they're supporting Trump. They don't trust the media, they don't trust the establishment, they don't really trust anything or anyone. And so I think that HBD is kind of the equivalent of a high human capital Gribble. It's somebody who has sort of lost faith in the scientific establishment. Nathan Kofnes is an example of this, of someone who's just like, this thing is woke, this thing is corrupt, we have to move on, we have to, fight this. But a lot of people aren't listening to him. And again, going back almost 15 years or something, when I was like going online and finding this stuff at, looking into HBD, and I went to a psychologist, and I said, hey, you're a psychologist. What do you think about, Rushton and Lynn and all these people? And he said, I'm aware of that. And I'm like, well, why don't you talk about it? And he was like, well, it's socially corrosive. We can't talk about that. So I think that, Elon Musk sort of publicly endorsing these things, well, that is an ambiguous position at best, because you're not going to find him doing an interview where he talks about these things in a way that the average person can understand. You're going to get some news story from The Atlantic that says, oh, Elon Musk follows this account and he posted, wow, is this true? Under something. So it's like, clearly, I mean, Elon's form of dog whistling is very loud, but it is still ultimately a dog whistle. He's still ultimately not willing to communicate, like go on Joe Rogan and say, oh, did you know race realism is true, Joe? And Joe's like, Jamie, pull that up. Look at the charts. That's not going to happen. Joe Rogan isn't going to have Jared Taylor on. I mean, I don't know. Would he have Nathan Kofnes on? I don't think so. But I don't know. Maybe I'll be surprised in a few years. But again, even if that did happen, I think there's a point here that Joe Rogan is like a patriarch of the Gribble movement. He is somebody who's constantly, there's UFOs and we believe every conspiracy theory. That attitude, while it there is a cost associated with it. It definitely does make it harder to manage a society that is increasingly disaffected, disenchanted, disturbed, distrusting. That presents a cost. I mean, that really does lower social trust and make our institutions less effective. Um, but does it actually positively create a new civil religion that can replace the old one? I don't think so. So, there are a lot of people who would say, well, we have to like collapse civilization or collapse the American government, or we have to degrade like anything that makes the situation worse, accelerates this process. And then once we've hit rock bottom, then like a phoenix from the ashes, we're going to emerge from that with a totally new thing. But I think that causality is basically backwards. I think that if you have a really good new idea, and Julius Caesar is kind of an example of this, Napoleon is an example of this, Lenin is an example of this. But if you have a really powerful idea, maybe it's good or maybe it's bad, but you have a powerful idea that actually can provide a new civic religion, and then you come with some military force and you force it through, then actually I think you can change the system. But I talk a lot about the Middle East and Zionism, where you have countries like Egypt, where functionally Egypt is an ally of Israel, or Saudi Arabia is an ally of Israel, Jordan is an ally of Israel. And yet the vast majority of the citizenry, the populace of those countries, really hates Israelis. Like, they're very anti-Semitic, but it doesn't matter because those governments are autocracies and they do what they want, and the people are cynical and they don't have any power. And so I think ultimately what HBD does is it adds just another straw in the camel's back of saying, we're not going to have a functional government anymore. We're going to have people who are disaffected, low social trust. They don't trust our institutions. They're even smart people are not going to go to college because it's too woke, or it's controlled by the CIA, as Candace Owens says. So this is bad, but it's not actually just like if things get worse enough that somehow a solution is going to come about. The last example I'll give is South Africa, where it's very bad. I mean, everything is collapsing in South Africa. It's a really bad situation. And the result is not that, well, okay, now because it's really bad, some, people are going to finally wake up and do something about it. And it's going to, the whites of South Africa, if they felt that they wanted to form a separatist government, they have the power to do that. The government is not actually effective enough to stop them in a military context. But they don't want to do that because if you actually talk to white South Africans, not the far right 10% who are on Twitter and who speak in English to the rest of it, I'm talking about the people speaking Afrikaans who live in South Africa. If you talk to them and you say, well, what do you think about a military coup? They're going to be like, oh, no, that's dangerous. That's crazy. Maybe we can increment, I don't know, something good will happen. So I view that as a religious problem, a spiritual problem, a problem of morale. If white South Africans had some crazy Calvinist Dutch preacher who is like the Father Coughlin of Dutch Calvinism, and he came out and he's like, we have to create a new state, and somehow he energized people with a new vision, that would be much more effective than showing white South Africans some HPD data and here's the technical details about why you should want to form a separatist government. People point to Orania, but Orania is clearly not an adequate response to the level of chaos that's going on. So I don't know. I'm gonna hold my breath there and let you interject, because I have a tendency to start ranting.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, and I guess this is my point of tension here, is that I don't necessarily think that the international community will allow white South Africans, given the current civil religion and its current state of still institutional power, to actually create a separatist state that is created along racial lines. Just I don't think it's allowed for this particular subgroup of people. I think there would be, maybe not direct force, but by proxy, there would definitely be put down quite quickly. So theoretically, they could do it, but practically, I don't know. But I think you're right.
I agree.
I know, I know South Africans who, used to work with me in London, and their opinions were very much more aligned with white Afrikaners, South Africans, were more aligned. This was a few years ago, but they were very much, members of elite human capital, quite liberal, quite left wing, very concerned about racism. Definitely not aligned with people who, like you said, are maybe a minority view and are more kind of far right, but are still in South Africa, which might tell you a little bit about, why they're so enraged and that. So, yes, I think it's my perspective is that, I can really understand these movements, but at the same time, at the macro level, what you lay out, the idea that there is no serious contender for civil religion once we take this one apart with glee, because that's essentially the business that everyone is in nowadays, to kill the woke behemoth. It is really tough for me to imagine what could come after, except for a million schizophrenic subcults, which are already forming, obviously, because that's kind of what is the contender to this. But it's definitely not better. It really doesn't feel like it's a good replacement. It could get much worse. And I think a lot of people have this imagination that somehow something congruent will arise of this, and the people who are actually on the side of truth will end up victorious, and the people who now have realized wokeness is a problem are going to be the winners, because at the end of whatever kerfuffle collapse thing is going to happen. I think history has not been kind to revolutionaries. So that's also, this also might be my kind of biological situation right now. I'm a mother of two small children. Like, the idea of itching for collapse is not, it really doesn't appeal to me anymore in any way. And also I'm kind of heartened by the fact that in many ways I think so-called wokeness has peaked, and in many ways it's being rolled back. And in many ways, it's softening, but also a lot of people really don't seem to see this as a win. You could see it's kind of splitting between people who see this as a win, like Hanania, and people who are kind of disappointed that it's not escalating. That it's not accelerating, because beyond the acceleration is the collapse, and that's kind of what they're waiting for. But I'm like, I prefer to skip the collapse. I'm sorry, I know it sounds real hot and sexy to Mad Max through this whole, next century, but preferably, I mean, there's quite a lot of advantages to modernity, even though it's, hollow and soulless and all that. But, the central heating and electricity and all that's quite good. So I'd love to keep that. But yeah, it's a strange time, and it's really hard to know, where to hitch your wagon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hitching my wagon to technology. I think that technology kind of got us into this mess. It's going to get us out of this mess. And I think that I'm much more bullish on biotech than I am on nanotech and AI. I think that the biggest contribution of AI is that it's going to make a lot of office workers unemployed. But I think that other than that, I don't really have high hopes that it can innovate creative solutions or engage in mathematical proofs. I think that it's very good at taking large sets of data and replicating. And frankly, if you've ever worked in an office, you understand that most of what you do is redundancy and repeating what somebody else did, and that you're not using any creativity or critical thinking skills. So AI will be very effective at replacing lawyers. It will even be effective, I think, at replacing doctors. Anything where there's a large data set and it's just like millions of people have diabetes, and we have a lot of data on diabetes. And so if you feed in your symptoms and give a blood test to an AI, it's going to be able to identify if you have diabetes or not. You don't need a doctor to diagnose you anymore. So I think it's going to hit any repetitive aspect of our economy very hard. I think things that have to do with manual labor, going into someone's house, being a plumber, being an electrician, it's really hard actually to build a robot that is cheaper than a human being in like fixing a plumbing problem. So people will still have the opportunity to be gainfully employed. I don't think the economy will collapse or something. But I think that a lot of those white collar professions are going to be hit hard by AI. But at the same time, I don't think AI actually has the ability to be very innovative and creative just by the nature of the fact that it is basically a data aggregator. It creates a statistical model from a large amount of data and it spits out the most probable answer, which inherently lends itself to a repetitive route way of thinking. I talk a little bit about the difference between East and West, and if you look at Eastern writing systems, they're very based on memorization. It's not like this phonetic alphabet we have where you can mix and match letters and create new words, and it's so flexible and individualistic. In the East, everything's about memorization, and that's how their state bureaucracy worked for 1,000 years. Is you have to memorize these million statements and regurgitate them back. Whereas in the West, we have focused a little bit more, especially since the 12th century, on being creative, being a critical thinker, showing that you can kind of be outside the box. Sometimes that's been a slow process at getting ourselves there, but I think that has shown itself to be really powerful. I think, especially in a military context, the ability to surprise your enemy and to be innovative is crucial, rather than just spamming a bunch of, when Hannibal was spamming huge elephants at Scipio Africanus, and then he was like, well, maybe we should just dodge the elephants. And Hannibal was like, I never thought of that. So that's a very powerful example of how just having a million Chinese tanks, can be totally rendered useless if you have a little bit of ingenuity. And so I think that's where AI fails. And so I'm not a believer in this singularity sort of thing. I believe in biological technology. Maybe this is like a woo-woo spiritual thing, but I think DNA is the best technology we have, and it's far superior to silicone technology. I think we need to figure that out. Every time I say that, people say, oh, but DNA is so complicated. And I'm like, yeah, it is complicated, and that's why we need to figure it out. And it's kind of the nanotech stuff, the silicon stuff is this intermediary. We're too dumb to figure out genetics, and so we have to screw around with this inferior silicon stuff. But I think ultimately you're going to find that biology is the best technology we have, and that is what I'm placing my hopes in, is that we're going to have the ability basically, and it could come from a number of different directions, but I would just say generally, reproductive technology has the ability to alter society in the same way that the Industrial Revolution did. And that's why I find more sympathy with the left than the right, because I just feel that for all the flaws of the left, and it has many flaws, it is typically more open to the idea of some form of reproductive freedom, whereas on the right, as you mentioned, you have Christian nationalists who are like, we can never experiment biologically. That's Satanism. Alex Jones is going to talk about the globalists and the human-animal chimeras and the hybrids and stuff. So the Gribble voters seem to be completely opposed to any kind of experimentation in biological technology, whereas the left, again, for all its wokeness and its flaws, actually seems to be ultimately more open to that. I mean, transgenderism is not too far from transhumanism. And again, I think that most people's visions of transhumanism is derived from the Terminator and Silicon tech, which is not accurate, in my opinion. I don't think that's the future. But I do think that being able to, at least genetically screen and give people the option of what sort of children they want to have some degree of choice in that, I think there are cumulative runaway effects just from that alone, let alone all the other potential technologies that we haven't invented. So that's my vision of the future. I think that the ideology is going to kind of follow the technology, and that our duty right now is just to let the tech do its thing and let it bear its fruits. In the same way that if I was living in feudal Europe, I would say like, okay, Gutenberg printing press. All right, steam engine, we got to get this thing going, because if we ever want to solve feudalism, which was a pretty brutal system in a number of ways, we're going to need tech to do that. Otherwise, you're not going to out ideology the feudal system. You're not going to win an ideological debate with a feudal aristocrat. You just have to defeat him in military terms and technological terms.
Yeah, and I wonder how you think this whole kind of battle over human biodiversity overlays with reproductive tech, because on the one hand, it could be that it's inevitable that people will, given that this is going to be on the table, the reality of heritability of different traits and all of this stuff is going to be a bit more public, just because, just getting informed about this technology and its wide applicability is going to be essentially getting informed about the fact that there are certain traits are heritable. We have more here, they have less here. And maybe there's going to be incentives for people who have lesser desirable traits to be maybe even subsidized to get this, or do you think maybe it's going to be a moot point that the technology is just going to solve it, and then it's not really going to matter that people are diverse, because they won't be very soon.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be rough. It's going to be crazy. It's going to be unpredictable, and it's going to produce contradictory results, just like industrialization produced Nazism, but it also produced communism. So people are going to go in entirely different directions out of this. Nick Land has this concept. I don't know if he calls it hyper racism, but it's something along those lines. And my prediction is that a lot of people would say, well, hey, if we have this biotech and it's very clear that, human personality traits and intelligence, all these things are heritable, isn't that going to make people racist? And I would say, yeah, maybe, but not in the way that you'd necessarily think. And I actually think it's kind of interesting. We already have a transracial movement in America, and actually it's all around the world, because we have a skin lightening industry, and we have a skin darkening industry, and we have a rhinoplasty industry. So people are already changing their race. Now, that's a very bold way to put it, because if someone goes to a tanning salon, do you say they changed their race? No, but it is a spectrum of behavior where people already, through cosmetic surgeries and procedures, are seeing that they have the ability to experiment with themselves. Obviously, transgender as a phenomenon fits into this. People are experimenting with themselves, let alone their children. And that is not traditional blood and soil racism. That is something kind of new. It's obviously related, but it's kind of new. And so it's a form of elective tribalism, where you say, I want to be part of, this group of people or that group of people. And it's not based in your ancestry as much. It's based in your values. It's based in ideology. It's based in the choices that you make. So I think we might actually just skip the traditional racism part and skip to a almost a speciesism thing, where there's people who are just so genetically radically different that it's not even appropriate to call them different races anymore, because they might not even be compatible to produce fertile offspring. So I don't know how quickly this will happen. Obviously, if it happens very slowly over a long period of time, then you would expect to see, a traditional form of racism rear its head. But I think if it's so fast and it's so sudden and surprising to people, because often that's how technology works. Like, it's not like you forecast the Gutenberg printing press for 100 years and you slowly acclimate people to okay, well, someday we're going to have this, someday we're going to have this. No, it's just like it suddenly comes out, and then boom, Protestant Reformation, like within a very short amount of time. So that's my model for how this change happens, is that you and I can talk about it, but the average person has no clue what's going on, and it's just going to hit them someday. It's going to be a total surprise, and the effects of that, I don't think, are going to be a reversion to traditional concepts of racial hierarchy. I think it's just going to be a total speed run into something completely new.
Yeah, I remember. I don't know if I made this observation, but I thought it was really essentially in line with what you explained. The appeal of Kim Kardashian as kind of a transracial amalgamation of aspects from every. She essentially kind of her frame is was she like some sort of not Middle Eastern, Iranian or something like that.
She's
Armenian, she's
Armenian,
Armenian,
actually.
exactly. She's
Yeah.
Armenian. And then she's got, some aspects from African Americans and some, kind of some more bodacious aspects. So, a Northern European nose by surgical intervention, like all sorts of, layers to her. And in total, yeah, she is kind of a composite of her own making or whoever is on her team. But it is interesting that it's definitely a product of the 21st century. Yeah, I think even just this whole concept of Instagram face, like this is, she's probably kind of pioneered it, but all of these, the sharp, angular, high, cheekbone structure and all this type of stuff. This isn't, particular to any race, but it's particular to all of them together. It's a strange modern phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people who disagree with you in terms of who has the high cheekbones and whatever, but that's a granular point. But yeah, the overall point is true that, you do go on Instagram and you notice that all of the Black girls are, changing things about themselves and using makeup strategically and straightening the hair. And so they're kind of converging on this kind of ideal type. And then the white girls are bronzing their skin and they're, whatever, doing the angel hair, baby hair, whatever. So that they're from both sides, people are trying to converge on this ideal type because that's ultimately how fashion works. Like, yeah, sure, we have different cliques, we have different genres, but there's always going to be a popular kid. There's always going to be an ideal type that people are converging on. And that's what it is at the moment. And obviously, we're going to look back on it and say, well, that was cringe and, that was silly. But yeah, people are attempting to homogenize. And part of that is the fact that we feel that we have lost our center as a culture, that we no longer have. I actually recorded a podcast on fashion on Substack with the Turtle Dove, and we discussed this fact that there is no like common core to our fashion. And so what ends up happening is the trends are very fast, they're vicious. One day it's in, one day it's out, and it's like it's a war zone out there in fashion. And I think that reflects this instability of our culture at this point. We don't feel like we have this common stable tradition. And it's really interesting if you go back farther, say 100 years ago or something, and you ask people, like, what kind of music do you like? And then you ask their parents and you ask their grandparents. And if their great grandparents were alive, you could ask them. And I think you'd find that they would all pretty much like what we would call folk music. They like various forms of folk music where they would say, well, I like, if they're upper class, they'd say, I like Beethoven and Bach and so on. But there was no intergenerational change in fashion or music, at least not at the rate it is today. I mean, at the time they would have said, well, he likes Beethoven, but I like Bach. That's how our generations are different. But now it's a meme of the boomers and the zoomers and the millennials that they're so different. They have such different tastes in music. They have such different tastes in fashion and politics. And that's due to the instability of our culture, that we don't have this central authority structure that tells us, what's up and down. And so people are just grasping at straws and throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah. Yeah, it's you can see this in political fashions as well. I mean, it's quite moving at a breakneck speed, maybe to a synthesis, but probably to more and more like subcults and kind of the more schizophrenic places. I know we're coming up on time, and I will ask you the last question. That's the question of the show. Do you have a recommended thinker? It could be any sort of type of person that you think is maybe underrated and you'd like people to check out.
I mean, I was just going to mention Catherine D. I mean, she just had a guest post up there speaking exactly to what you're saying on this almost like a Pokemon card or MMORPG. You choose your class like you choose your politics. So you have anarcho-syndicalist Islamic feminism, and you have all these wacky political ideologies. And I think she's doing a really good job of documenting that. And I would really call her a sociologist slash psychologist. She has a lot of in-depth interviews with people. I've done an interview with her that may come out eventually. You'll have to, they're all anonymous, so you'll have to guess which one is me. But yeah, I mean, she, I think, is doing some great work. So definitely go check her out.
Yeah, absolutely. She's been on the show, I think, twice, and yeah, I think she's definitely one of the best people in terms of internet history, and like you said, the sociology of the moment, which is, yes, if you like it or not, on the internet. So where can people find you, and what should they check out of yours?
Well, you got to go to deepleft.substack.com. You got to check out, I have over 100 articles published, hundreds of thousands of words. I'm actually surprised that people read some of this stuff because the last article I put out was 8,000 words, which is 16 pages. That's like 2 chapters in a book. And people actually read it and they enjoyed it. So I don't know if people have too much time on their hands. I certainly do. But I think it's for a good cause. I think we're doing interesting stuff. And if you have a moment, check it out. There's also shorter articles. I put up paywalled posts. It's like poetry and fiction and dream journals and diaries and stuff. So there's a little bit of something for everyone. I am starting to not hire, but recruit guest writers to come on, do literature reviews and other things. So look for that in the near future.
Excellent, excellent. Yes, I'll put it in the show notes. And yeah, I do recommend people check it out. I read the 8,000 word article this morning, and it's very good. So please do read it. Thank you so much. And hopefully we can do this again.
Absolutely. I really loved it. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming.
If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to support me to make more of these conversations and continue the project that is my writing and this podcast, please do go to alexpashuta.com, which is my Substack, where you'll see the archive of every post that I've ever posted, everything that I've ever written and recorded, and some really cool community features and notes and all the new Substacky things that you have. Or you could go to Patreon /AK Subversive, where you can find the audio of every podcast ever recorded, and also a few community features. Whichever way you'd like to contribute, I would appreciate it immensely. It's what keeps the lights on, the little Chinese twinkle lights that I bought for the higher production value of the show. And I thank you so much for supporting me throughout these years and making the show possible.